Okay, great. Well, thank you for joining. Welcome again to the third session of the UN Trust Fund's online project management training and how to manage projects in accordance with our grant agreements. And today's session is on data collection, and we will also touch on monitoring and how what you need to do to collect your baseline data and monitor your project during the period of your grant. I'm Gemma Wood. I am the Monitoring and Evaluation Manager for the UN Trust Fund, so this is my area of work. And I will be here to support you in the process of data collection, monitoring and evaluation, as is your portfolio manager. So this session will also be complemented by another session in a few weeks, Module 6, on monitoring. So today's section is an introduction, but we will talk more about it in a few more weeks, especially in regard to the technicalities of entering your baseline data into the online system. So today is an introduction to data collection to help you start planning. And in a few more weeks, we'll do more in-depth session. And if you ever need any advice, we're here for you throughout. So now I'm going to share the presentation. It's quite a long presentation today. I think it will take about 1 hour at least, and then there will be time for questions. I may not go through every slide because it is quite long, but you have the slides and the script for you to read. Okay, so as I said, the objectives of this session is to explain to you what the requirements are in terms of planning data collection and how to monitor your project, specifically then how to report to the UN Trust Fund on that. But in general, we will talk about how and why we measure change and monitor projects, why that's important to good project management. And I will be teaching you some tips on how to design indicators and data collection methods. And critically, we will also talk about ethics and safety. Ethics and safety is an issue across all project activities, but in particular when you're collecting data and, for example, talking to people about issues of violence, it can be a very sensitive subject that you need to pay attention to, therefore, the safety issues and ethical risks of collecting data on this issue. In my email, when I wrote to you about the session, I attached our guide to data collection and baselines, which sets out what the mandatory requirements are. But we also sent you a couple of optional tools. We have a checklist for reviewing your results framework that asks key pertinent questions to help you check, oh, is my results framework meeting the standards requested? And the same for data collection. We have a checklist that will help you think through your data collection. These are optional. They're just tools that you might find helpful. They pose questions for you and your team to consider, do I have the right data collection tools? Are my indicators smart? As well as these documents, we have a whole range of other resources and tools we will send you, and we're creating a dedicated web page. We have a web page where you will find example data collection tools in different languages and example safety and ethical protocols. So that will be coming to you as well after the session. So moving on to slide 2. Hopefully. So what are the requirements? Now, many of you, as I know, are project management experts, and many of you are probably monitoring and evaluation experts who have been experienced in data collection. So we want to learn from you as we go along. And so this will be very familiar to you, but for some of you, it might be completely new. In our project management for the Trust Fund projects, we generally see that there are 4 main stages in data collection, as set out in this picture. In the first stage of the project, you will design how you will collect data to monitor your project and collect the baseline. And then during the project, you will monitor the project routinely, which is every 6 months is the requirement for us, but you can do it more often, obviously, if you wish. And then at the very end of the project, we ask you to collect the final data at the end of the project, and we expect you to report on that 1 month after the project ends. And then at least 2 months after the project, we expect for large grantees to manage and deliver a final evaluation report, which is completed by an independent expert. For small, those of you receiving small grants under $150,000, this is not going to happen for all of you. It will happen for a selection of you, and we will contact you separately on that. But there are 4 main stages: the start, the baseline, during the project when you collect data to check project process, the final endline, and then the external independent evaluation. Today's session, I'm going to focus on the baseline predominantly, and that starting point of how you start preparing for data collection. But we will have other sessions on the other stages. So what is monitoring? I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but it's just the routine collection throughout your project of data and information so that you can track progress towards your project goal and your results. It helps you track whether your project's on track to achieve the results, but also helps you identify if there are trends and patterns and things going wrong or things going right that will help you adjust your project as you go along. You are responsible for this monitoring, and we only require that you report to us formally every 6 months online in our reporting tool, and we will have a session on that reporting tool. But you don't have to wait for that every 6 months. You may decide within your team to talk about your project once a month. You may even have weekly meetings where you review what information and data is coming in. You may decide to do it every 2 months. It really depends on your project, and it depends on the frequency of the data and information you're collecting. It can be something as simple as talking to the beneficiaries every week that might be coming to a training session, and then reflecting on what the beneficiaries are telling you about how they feel about the project activities. So monitoring comes in many different forms, and it really depends on the information that you're collecting. But for our purposes, for accountability to the trust fund, we will expect you to report every 6 months on the basis of any data you are collecting. What should be monitored? Well, ideally, you will be monitoring progress at all the different levels of your results framework. As I described in last week's session, the results framework is the primary tool we will be using to define your project and also then to monitor your project, and it will guide your monitoring and results-based reporting to the trust fund. So every 6 months we will ask you to report on your budget, what are you spending, your activities, and then at the results level we will ask you what results are you achieving. We don't expect you to have progress immediately. The first 6 months progress report, you may have very little to say, and that's understandable. You may only have expenditure to report and activities to report on. But after 1 year, 2 years, we would hope to see some progress reported at output, outcome, and goal level. So therefore, it's key that you have procedures and processes in place to monitor your project at all these levels. So your finance people would be monitoring the finance, and the project staff would be monitoring the activities and the results. Okay. Why is it important to monitor and measure? Sorry, I'm just going to put someone on mute. If you could put yourselves on mute when you arrive. For some reason, it's not automatic, which is quite annoying. I do say mute on entry, but sometimes it fails. Anyway, okay, so everyone is muted. We'll go back to the presentation. So I was talking about why monitoring is important. We don't want you to think that you're just doing this because we ask you to. We hope that you find monitoring and measuring change very useful to your organization. And it's very important for accountability to beneficiaries also, that it's participatory as much as possible. By checking on progress routinely, you're able to check whether your project is having both negative and positive consequences. If you're not asking the right questions and monitoring your project, something unforeseen could happen. You'll be able to manage your risks, you'll be able to share knowledge with your teams, and very importantly, you can check what do your beneficiaries think. They're the primary focus. And we're not just talking about the women and girls, but also if you're working with government or with NGOs or with men and boys, just check in with people as you go along. There's no point having a project if it's going in the wrong direction. So it's important at the very basic level to be asking beneficiaries, is this project meeting your needs routinely throughout the project? And this is just a funny graphic to show that if you're not checking in and monitoring your project, you might be going off a waterfall, off a cliff, which I'm sure nobody would do. But sometimes when we're day-to-day, we're so busy with implementing our project that we don't have time to step back and say, well, what is the information about progress telling us about the future? And we sometimes can go, we do it ourselves, we have to admit, in the UN. We can go, several months without having a team meeting, and then you think, wow, there's so much that we need to talk about. So at a basic level, monitoring is about routinely getting together, talking about what the project is doing and whether it is on track, because there might be something in the future or something that's happened that other people in the team need to know about. Now, earlier I talked about baseline and endline data. And what is data, in fact? Well, data can take many forms, and I'll describe that later. I mean, data is information, and it can be anything from numbers to opinions. And baseline data is the information excuse me, at the start of the project. So the baseline is the base, the beginning, and it has to be collected at the beginning, either before the project starts or at the very start. And so you can set the stage, it's the starting point. And the endline data is right at the end of the project. So then you can compare, well, what happened what was the status of the project at the beginning and what was the status at the end, and you can compare, well, what progress did your project help make. What's different when we talk about targets, and we will come to that, a target is what you're aiming for. So a data point is a point in time. Right now, I might say that I am managing to train 20 people today, and my target, though, is to train 60 people. And that was my target at the end. And then I collect the endline data, and I find out I was only training 50 people. So sadly, I didn't meet my target. So targets represent the results you're aiming to achieve. And I'm going to be talking about each of these steps. But you will be required to collect baselines, to collect endline and routine data, and set targets against which we can compare this data. And when does all this need to happen? Well, we touched on this in the first sessions on what are the mandatory requirements. But the baseline data, we ask you to collect it within the first 6 months of the project. For many of you, you might already have baseline data, therefore no action needs to be taken. For those of you who don't have baseline, or you might have some baseline data missing, you should collect it within the first 6 months, and then we will explain how you can enter that into your results framework during the reporting stage. But then the frequency of when you then do routine monitoring really depends on the indicator. As I said, we only expect you to report to us every 6 months formally, but you might have data and indicators that you collect every month, every week even, or every 2 weeks. That really depends on your project. So you may have your own systems and tracking tools to collect the data more regularly, but we ask you to formally collect data every 6 months and report against the baseline and towards the target that you are set. In general, though, looking at the results framework, we output indicators, as described in the first section, are things that you can deliver within, say, a year. So we hope that you would be able to monitor those every 6 months to a year. Outcome indicators are the longer term change. So you may not be able to find data on outcome indicators every 6 months. You may only be able to monitor those indicators once a year. Project goal indicators. Project goal is something that you achieve after 2 to 3 years or after the project, so you may not be able to collect data as regularly against the goal. So although we ask you to collect the data every 6 months, it doesn't mean that we think that there is data every 6 months. Sometimes there may not be anything to report, which is fine. And as noted at the bottom, if you have any challenges collecting data, you can just come and talk to us. We know that some projects follow strict timelines that are presented by the government even, or if you're working in schools, you have to wait until the school year begins. So you may not have baseline data in the first 6 months. So there may be exceptions. So this is the general rule. Now on the page, I have an example. But this example, oh, actually, this is the wrong example. So I'm just going to excuse me while I developed a different example that would be a bit easier for you to look at. So I'm just going to get that up. So we have a few examples to show you. And we can also show you real-time examples from real projects also that you might find useful. So going back to this example. So an example of what we mean here. So right now you're at the stage of step 1. Step 1 is here where you are currently drafting your project goals, you're checking your results frameworks. So perhaps you've come up with a goal such as women and girl survivors of violence in the community receive higher quality support services. So you've had your clear results chain. The next step is to draft indicators, which this session is about. And then the next step, once you've devised what you want to measure, you can collect data collection methods, set your data collection method. Once you have your method of data collection, you will collect the baseline data. And you will set a target of what you want to achieve. And then every 6 months, you will monitor formally and tell us what progress has been in your progress report. And at the very end of the project, you will give us the end line data. And in this example, the project came up with 2 indicators. One is a qualitative indicator, which states that perspectives of women and girl survivors in the targeted community on services received at the one-stop shop center. So they decided to measure what do the women and girls, the beneficiaries, think. Perspectives is about what they think of the services they're receiving, and that was the focus of the project. The project decided to do interviews, that the best method of measuring whether the women and girls were happy with the services was one-on-one interviews. And for that, they would have done an interview questionnaire and guide. The baseline, they talked to the survivors at the baseline, and they found that generally survivors of violence were very unsatisfied with the services. Now, there's probably a lot more information. If you read the notes section, I explain that for some indicators that might be asking for opinions, you might have an annex or a background document to unpack that further, but they've generalized the perspectives. So the baseline is that survivors are unsatisfied, and their target by the end of the project is that survivors are more satisfied. So it's quite simple. And then during the project, they decided not to collect data because they didn't want to have to keep asking survivors questions, which can be sensitive. But at the end of the project, they did interview survivors, and they found that generally survivors were much more satisfied. So this example illustrates what we will expect you to put in the results framework over the years. You will be expected to draft an indicator. For example, number of women survivors receiving support services. We will ask you to decide, well, how are you going to measure that indicator? And in this other example, they had their service statistics, that the service center had a record of the number of people receiving services. We will ask you to count and gather the baseline in the first 6 months. They found that 50 women were receiving services on average per month, and they wanted to increase this to their target of 250 women by the end of the project. In their first progress report, they found that 70 women were receiving services every month, and this increased to 350 women by the end. So they surpassed their target. Wonderful. So this is a quick example, and this is what we'll go into in more depth when we come to Module 6, is about how you would actually put this into the system. But at a basic level, we're looking for you to fill out your results framework in this manner. And right now we're at step 1, 2, and 3, and 4. So moving on to the next page. So who is going to do all this? You think, wow, goodness, there's a lot to do. Well, it doesn't have to be just you. You can hire consultants or other staff if you have the budget, if this is in your budget. You can hire people to help you collect data. But when it comes to the evaluation, it has to be someone external. And we wanted to give you a tip that if you want to hire the same company or consultants to collect the baseline, endline, and do the evaluation, you're very welcome to do that, as long as you follow our procurement guidelines and you get 3 quotes and make sure that you get a good, fair price. You can also hire people separately to do baseline, endline, and evaluation. There's also other ways that you can think about collecting data. You can talk to local universities even. Maybe you could partner with a local research institution or university to help you. So there are ways that you can get support to do this or pay for extra support. But on a basic level, it's the project staff who would collect data during the project, and it would be an external person who would come in and do the final evaluation. But just think what is cost effective for your organization. Now, I told you about the steps that you'll be setting indicators and setting data collection methods. So what is an indicator? Most of you probably know this, but just in case, um, what is an indicator? Well, first, you need to look at your results. So in that activity that I showed you, they wanted their result was that women survivors of violence would get services, better services. But how will you measure that? You have to turn that result into something you can measure, and that's called an indicator. Once you've created your indicator, you design a method for measuring that indicator, which is the data collection method. And examples of data collection methods are surveys, questionnaires, interviews, or simply counting things. I recommend you think about the indicators and data collection methods together. Sometimes people will devise an excellent indicator and find that they don't have a suitable method. So think of these together. Also, some data collection methods can be very expensive, so you will want to be thinking about this together. Don't just devise an indicator and then forget to think about the method until later. What needs to be measured? Well, as I said, you'll be monitoring the full results framework. It's quite easy to monitor your budget and your activities, but the results can be quite challenging. So as we talked about in the first few sessions, the project goal that needs to be measured, as the project goal has to focus on improvements in the lives of women and girls, you will want to be measuring, has there been any change in the lives of women and girls? At the outcome level, which is the intermediate result, which might be achieved after 1 to 2 years, the change that we're hoping you will achieve is around changes in individuals or communities, or institutions and systems or policies. Sometimes this is focused mainly on secondary beneficiaries. For example, there might be a change in the behavior of community leaders. So you will need to measure that change. And at output level, it's those things that you're directly influencing as an organization. And the change is usually, again, around individuals, resources, institutions, or policies. But it really depends on your project. But you will need to measure change at each level. So I've given some examples there. So at the output level, for example, for me, I'm delivering this training, and my output would be that you have an improved knowledge of data collection methods and how to devise them. So I will devise an indicator, for example, percentage of people attending my training who have improved knowledge or not. So you'll be measuring change at all the levels of your results framework. So you will need to devise an indicator. We recommend that you devise at least 1 up to 3 indicators per result. So as you have one project goal, you will devise 1 to 3 indicators. More is better. I mean, not more is better, but say 2 is a good medium. But you don't want too many indicators either. And what is an indicator? As a reminder, indicators can be either qualitative or quantitative, and it's a variable that provides a simple means to measure achievement and to reflect changes. So it's a variable. It will neither be positive nor negative. It needs to be able to give you a measure that can both measure positive or negative change. Indicators are not the target, they're simply what you want to measure. Here are some examples. What do we mean by quantitative and qualitative? Well, at the top, I've given 2 examples here of quantitative indicators. The first is number of survivors of sexual violence who called a hotline. And that's quantitative because it's a quantity. Numbers and percentages are quantitative. And these simply count things or measure numbers or ratios or rates. So if you devise a quantitative indicator, I would expect to see a number or a percentage. Right at the bottom of this example, there are qualitative indicators, and qualitative indicators measure quality, or whether or not something exists, or whether or not something meets a standard. So whether or not a law exists is a qualitative indicator because it exists or it doesn't. There's a quality to it. And that can be it's a very simple indicator. If you're working on something like putting a policy in place, you can have an indicator of simply the policy exists or it doesn't. Obviously, there's a lot of work that goes under that you've been advocating for a law or advocating for a policy. But it is quite fine to have an indicator that just measures the existence of something. A very important one for us at the Trust Fund that we encourage you to have is one on perspectives or opinions. The perspectives and opinions of survivors and women and girl beneficiaries is the most important to our projects. So that's a qualitative indicator where you can simply measure the perspectives. And there are other indicators, which I've put in the middle, which you can combine indicators. And this is especially useful for larger projects that collect a large amount of qualitative data. You can actually have something called a mixed indicator, which measures both quality, say perspectives, in a numerical way. You may have heard of something called the Gender Equitable Men Scale. This is a survey that goes out to men asking them, what is your opinion on women's rights? And they will set a scale. They'll say, oh, I'm negative about women's rights or positive. And then you can talk to hundreds of men and you can turn that into a percentage and say, well, 50% of men we spoke to had negative attitudes or vice versa. So those are the main three types: quantitative indicators, qualitative, and mixed. But the key thing is it has to have a unit of measure. So when you're devising your indicators and we're checking them, we would always expect to see a percentage, a rate, a ratio, a number. The beginning of the indicator always starts with what you are measuring, the unit of measure. It is not a target. So we would not expect to see 100 survivors because that's the target. What we want to see is, what are you measuring? The unit of measure. Oh, I've just messed that. That just looks messy now. I hope that makes sense to you. Here's an example. So what we have is a project goal. I'll just go through one. The project goal is women and girls experiencing sexual violence in community in South Africa have improved access to health services. In this goal, what we're measuring, what we should be measuring, is whether the women and girls have experienced a change in their access to services. So what can you measure? Well, there's several things you could measure. You could measure that both qualitatively and quantitatively, and doing both gives you a nice balance. So you could measure perspectives of women about the services provided through interviews. You could also measure how many women are accessing the services, which gives you a sense of whether or not more women are accessing. And then to measure the quality, you can measure through a survey, for example, the percentage of women who are using the services who report satisfaction or not. The next example is the outcome. Mobile health clinics are equipped, resourced, and able to provide health services. So in this example, we're measuring the institution, the health clinic. Has the institution and the services it's provided changed? Is there a change in the quality? Again, there are a number of ways you could measure that. You could measure it quantitatively by just simply looking at the number of health clinics, because you may just assume that more health clinics would mean more access. You could be measuring whether or not there's a budget for the health clinic, because to be resourced you would need money. And you can also look at the type of services. So really, depending on your project, you would need to decide what the real focus is. But these are examples of how you can turn a result into an indicator. I won't go through the last example because you can read that in your own time. What makes a good indicator? And feel free to critique the indicators I showed you, because they were very short, so it's very hard to get the best indicator. This is a checklist, and this is part of your package. I sent you a checklist in the email, so you have this, but it's useful when you're looking at your indicators to ask yourself these questions. Does it include a unit of measure? As I said, your indicator must include what you're measuring, whether that's a number, a percentage, a perspective, the existence of something. Indicators don't include the target, because if you're saying that you want to reach 300 women, you don't just want to measure that. What if you don't reach 300 women? You want to know whether you're reaching women, full stop. So don't include the target in the indicator, and don't include a direction of change, such as an increase. You don't just want to measure whether services improve, because what if they're not improving? So sometimes if you put an indicator that's too positive, you forget to measure the negative. So make the indicator non-directional and neutral. Only measure things that are relevant. As I said, you might decide that only one indicator is needed for your project goal or your outcome. That's fine if it's the most important thing. Make sure it's specific, that it reads well. Make sure that you can measure it. As I said, don't devise a measure that's too expensive. On the previous page, I showed you an example of this survey of men called the Gender Equitable Norms, where you could survey hundreds of men. That might be feasible if you have the money, but if it's not, if you don't have the money, don't feel that you have to do it. There are always cheaper ways. Only measure what you need to measure. Make sure that it's something that you can measure consistently. If you're doing a survey of people's attitudes, can you go back and survey them again? If you can't, maybe it's not the best. So these are some tips in devising good indicators. Bearing these tips in mind, here is a test. On this page, you'll see that there's a project goal. Girls experience greater safety and respect for their human rights in 5 schools in the targeted communities by the end of the project. That's the result, sorry, that's the result. So they want to achieve greater safety and respect for girls in 5 schools. Someone has drafted an indicator, and it reads, better attitudes among male students and teachers by the end of the project. Now, bearing in mind the tips that I just mentioned, is this a good indicator? Is it relevant to the goal? Is it measurable? Is it non-directional? Is it specific? Now, I would say, and it's an obvious one, but it's not relevant because they're measuring attitudes of men. It's not non-directional. They're only interested in measuring better attitudes. And it's not clear how it would be measured. So this is a bad example. So a better example are on the page here, and I will let you read this in your own time, given the time we're at. But obviously, you would actually be measuring the girls' experiences, and you would want to measure whether or not they feel safe. So not just that they feel safe, but whether or not. So you can read these examples at your own time. So that's indicators. But once you've devised your indicator, what next? Once you've devised your indicator, and together while devising your indicator, to be honest, you should do this together, you need to decide how you will measure it. And here on the page are some examples of quantitative methods, as in ways to collect numbers and percentages. You can collect quantitative information through surveys and questionnaires. If they're ticking a box, you can see the visual here where they're ticking opinions. You can then make that into numbers. You can quantify it. You can do surveys the way that I send a test to you. There's other methods. You can get statistics. You might be working with health clinics. You might be working with the police. You might be working with hotlines that may have records and service statistics. So do think about using existing data. When you're collecting data, you don't necessarily have to devise your own methods. You might find that there are already there's already data available through perhaps the people that you work with. So these are examples of quantitative methods. For qualitative methods, which is when you're looking at people's opinions and perspectives, this is when it's mainly about interviews, group discussions, talking to people to get case studies, observing participants or analyzing policies. So this is when you're looking at the quality. And please don't assume that these are simpler than the quantitative. You have to be trained and have technical skills to interview people. So those were some examples of data collection methods. And when you're thinking through your data collection method, and I included this in the email yesterday, I've included this checklist. Think through, well, your method to make sure that it's feasible. So you've devised an indicator, such as measuring the perspectives of women on their services. Now you have to think, well, how am I going to do that? What method? Are you going to use a survey? Are you going to do focus groups with women? Are you doing in-depth interviews? Once you've decided the method, what is the instrument or tool? And by that I mean someone has to sit down and write the interview questions. Someone has to write the questionnaire. Is that going to be you or hiring someone to do it? When are you going to collect that data? When are you going to interview people? At the end, at the beginning, monthly? Then think about how many people you will interview. This is it can be quite a technical, scientific process for some larger projects. Oh, something happened. Sorry, someone decided to share their screen. So going back to mine, how many people will you interview? You don't have to interview everyone. That's totally unfeasible. You might decide to interview 10 to 20% of your target group. There are methods and ways that you can devise that, and we will have examples. The indicators we've talked about, but then you will also might have procedures. How will you identify the people to collect data? This can be sensitive. If you want to interview survivors, how will you identify survivors? You have to do that ethically and safely. So that's the next point. How will you ensure confidentiality? Finally, who will analyze the data? So when you're devising your indicators and data collection methods, do move on to these questions, because there can be quite a lot of work behind every method that you do have to think about. And make sure you have a plan for these methods. Moving on to ethics and safety. So the rest of the presentation will be mainly around ethics and safety before we close. So be another 15 minutes or so, and then we will finish. I mentioned ethics and safety before. What do we mean by that? Well, the bottom line is respect. Respect for everyone, respect for each other. In the pursuit of our projects and data collection methods, we have to respect that people may not be involved. We also have to respect that for many of the people we work with, they may have already had their trust violated. So we do not want to replicate this in either the design of our project activities or data collection. What does this mean in practice? It means, as I said, if you're targeting survivors, then how will you select the people to interview? You have to get their permission. You have to be sensitive to the fact that their family or friends or whoever may not want to know that they're involved in the project. So you have to think carefully about how you approach people for data collection. People need to consent and be voluntary participants. If you're working with children, you will have to consider whether you need parental consent. For the UN, the age of the child is 18 or under. It may be different in your country, but we ask you to respect that. There are, if you're working in schools, particular processes you would need to go through to get parental consent through the school. There are for teenagers to 15 and over, there may be ways you can get the child's informed consent, but you do need to get parental consent if at all possible. Always be very cautious about confidentiality and privacy. For example, if you're collecting data in a community, where will you do the focus groups? Do you have a room that's private? Do you need to come up with a secret reason for why you're doing focus groups? We've had experience with projects in the past where the project staff will call women together for a focus group, but they will say to the rest of the community that the focus group is on health, women's health. They won't say that the focus group is on violence, so that they can make it a bit more sensitive for those participants who may not want to tell their family why they're coming to the focus group. Be very clear about the safety of your own staff. That's why also we are asking you to have the sexual harassment and exploitation policies in place. You need to be careful of the safety of all those involved, and make sure, for example, that you don't have single men on their own interviewing women on their own, and that you always have procedures in place to take care of everyone. We expect you always, if you're doing data collection that involves sensitive subjects, to make sure that you know if someone gets upset, what would you do? If you're interviewing someone and they become traumatized, do you know where you can refer them for further support? And there's a lot of guidance on this. So I did send you the link to the World Health Organization. Sorry. The World Health Organization is the best source. Sorry. The World Health Organization is the best. Sorry, someone didn't mute. Okay. Sorry, someone mute. Okay. Okay, I think we're fine now. No, someone still. If you could put your microphones. No, someone still. If you could put your microphones. Okay, fine. Next. So ethics and safety, there are some guidelines the WHO have which are excellent. So we've sent you the link, and they are the best. Now, you're not necessarily, these are relating to researchers. You're not researchers, but they're still highly relevant. We're not expecting you to do research, but the guidelines are very relevant. Okay, so I've talked about what are indicators, what are data collection methods, the ethical and safety considerations, and in that regard, what do we expect you to show us? We don't expect you to share with us every single tool. If you have like 20 indicators, you probably will be developing tools for those. We would recommend only, limit the number of data collection methods to like 5 or 6. But of those, you need to send to the trust fund, to your portfolio managers, those which are sensitive. And I'm going to show you what I mean. So we don't need to see all your tools. We just want to see those that are sensitive, that might have ethical and safety concerns. This is a risk mitigation strategy. This enables us to give you guidance if we think there are ethical and safety risks that you haven't considered. We have examples of ethical and safety tools. Ideally, these would be in English, French, or Spanish, but if they're in local languages, don't worry, just send them to them in the local language. We don't want you spending additional money. What do we mean by protocols? By this, we mean that you would have a statement at the beginning of your questionnaire or interview guide setting out how you will protect the beneficiaries from risk or the person that you're interviewing. So if you have an interview guide with several questions, we would expect there to be a statement at the beginning of the interview questionnaire setting out setting out that the interview is confidential, setting out that they can stop the interview at any time, a guide for the interviewee on giving them referrals to support. So for every data collection method, there should be some introductory text or protocol setting out how you will help the beneficiary and how you will ensure that any information provided is treated confidentially and safely. Now, it's different for every tool, so it's hard to explain, but we have examples. You can provide an umbrella. Many organizations will have one policy, one procedure, but it's not specific enough. If someone is interviewing someone, what are they going to say? You have to be quite specific. If you give them a blanket policy, how will you know that the staff member really understands the blanket policy? So sensitive data collection methods can include in-depth interviews with survivors or children, or any interviews and data collection methods that ask questions about violence specifically. Also, anything that's going to involve confidential information, anything in schools, working with kids. So we don't need to see the interview guide where you're asking a government official for their opinion on a violence against women law. That's not sensitive. And government officials aren't hopefully as sensitive as others. Well, they may be politically, but hopefully not emotionally sensitive. But anything to do with survivors or women and girls where you might be asking sensitive questions, likewise men and boys. If you're asking men and boys about gender attitudes or about violence, how are you asking that question? These can be quite sensitive because you don't want to inadvertently cause more problems. I'm not going to go through this slide because of the time, but the reason we're raising all these issues is because some data collection methods like interviews, they really can be difficult and you do need training. Don't just throw a project staff member out there and say, please go interview survivors, because it's actually quite a specialist task and you need training. So we have some tips on things like that, but we will do extra sessions on these if you ask them. Slide 28, this gives you an example of an ethical safety protocol. So on the left, you'll see a verbal consent form. So in this example, Physicians for Human Rights, an NGO, is interviewing someone. And so you'll see that they've been given a script. So this is what we're looking for. So before the interview, the project staff member or the data collection person reads the script. They say, I am conducting an interview, blah, blah, blah. I will be recording the interview. The tape will be destroyed. Your name will not be linked to the interview. The interview guide describes risks and benefits to the interviewee so they can make an informed consent. They make it clear there's no compensation, and they make it clear what the person's rights are. So that's an example. And then the data collection method would be the actual interview questions. On the right, there's an example for a focus group. And again, the person conducting the focus group has a script to read. They say that they would like to thank the group, and they explain that, for example, there's a hotline number. So if any of them become upset or they want some additional support, there are some ways you see highlighted in yellow that the focus group person has places to refer people to if need be. We have a lot of these examples in French, English, and Spanish, so you're not alone in devising these. So we're coming to the end, and you think, oh my goodness, there's so much information. Well, please don't panic. We don't need hundreds of indicators and hundreds of data collection methods. Neither do you. The picture on the right shows someone overwhelmed with information. Do not overwhelm yourself. If you have 10 good indicators and 3 or 4 good data collection methods, that is sufficient. If you're interviewing survivors or beneficiaries, that's one method. Interviewing or doing focus groups with service providers, and then you're doing some analysis of service statistics or training, data from training. Don't keep it simple. Comes to my next slide. Only measure those things which are really relevant and will really help you measure progress towards your project. Keep it simple. Interview questions should only be about 10 of them. Don't ask pages and pages. Who has time? Think about their time, think about your time. Is anyone else measuring change or have data that you can access? Are there organizations locally that can help you? Are there examples and tools that have already been prepared? We do have those. And always use the same data collection method to measure several indicators. So if you're interviewing beneficiaries, you can measure both their perspectives on the community and attitudes, but also you can ask them personal questions about their own experiences. What if you find that it's too difficult to measure change? That can happen. For example, we highly recommend that you do not try and measure actual incidents of violence. Actual incidents of violence, i.e. asking a woman, did you experience violence in the last year, is a very, very technical and very sensitive question that really the World Health Organization and others and national statistics offices get involved in. And really it doesn't help you because incidents of violence can go up or down for many different reasons. So think about proxy indicators. One of the most important to us is about perceptions. How are women feeling? So ask them whether they feel safer. You don't have to know whether incidents of violence has gone up or down because you might be one small project in one small community. So keep it simple. We have some resources we will send you. There's a whole booklet with example indicators. Unfortunately, that's only in English. We have our own indicators. So the UN Trust Fund has devised 15 indicators which we will ask you to look at and see whether you can introduce into your project. It's not mandatory, but we have some indicators that we find useful to measure progress across all the projects. There's an excellent guide called Researching Violence Against Women that provides lots of example data collection tools, how to run interviews, how to do focus groups. Again, it's focused on researchers. You're not researchers, so don't feel that you have to do the gold-plated standard, but it is useful. And there's lots of guidance on ethics and safety. So I've provided the links here. So the final slide, and we've just had 1 hour, great. So as a recap, what do you need to do now? Well, right now you're still working, either you're happy with your results chain or you're not. It's fine if you are. So you've validated your results with your portfolio managers within 3 months. You'll be devising your indicators and data collection tools and sending us the most sensitive ones and protocols. Within 3 months means for most of you the end of November. If you have any problems with that deadline, speak to your portfolio manager. We know that some methods can take longer to devise. And then you'll start collecting your baselines, and we'll ask you to submit that within the first progress report. One final word, we don't expect you to do any kind of baseline study. When we're talking about baseline data, we simply mean entering some information in the results framework. We don't expect you to do lots of research. So I'm going to go back, I'm going to go back to what we really need. Slide 9. What we mean by providing us the baseline is that what we need is you to complete the baseline data column of your results framework. And as I've noted at the bottom of this slide, you may want to provide additional analysis. That is very useful for the qualitative information. If you've interviewed a number of women, you might want to write that up, analyze it, consider how does that impact on my targets. But this is not mandatory. It's useful to us, but it's not mandatory. What is mandatory is to put that number or that qualitative information into the baseline column. Now, if you already have baseline, then there's no action. However, I would say that many of you wrote your proposal a year ago, so your baseline data might not be the most current, and you might need to refresh some of your indicators. So that's where we're at now. Moving back to the end. I hope that this presentation has helped you in knowing what we expect in terms of indicators, data collection methods, ethical and safety protocols, and baselines. And now I will stop for questions. So we still have 30 minutes left. I know that was a very long session. If you're unable to stay for questions, you can send us questions by email. Okay, so thank you very much. Now you can ask questions in the box. Hopefully you can all see the chat box. So hello to everyone, and yes, feel free to ask some questions. Maybe I've just overwhelmed you with information. If you need time to think about that questions, you can always send by email. And we did send you the guidance, so hopefully a lot of the questions will be answered in the guidance. And if any of the we have portfolio managers online, we have Lorna. So if you want to add anything, Lorna, you're very welcome. It's from your experiences. No, no questions? Wow. So I've clearly answered all your questions. That's wonderful. I'll give it a couple more minutes. Feel free to leave if you don't have any questions. Don't feel you have to stay. We're developing this web page that I mentioned with all the examples, tools, which we will send you. And also, because you're all very experienced, if any of you have very useful tools that you've used over the years that you would like to share, we do want to encourage a network. So you can always, once we receive your tools, basically we would love to share them with other people, with all of you, so that we can be together sharing and developing our tools. So if I receive a good, part of the reason that we ask you to share the tools with us is not just for our purposes, but we also then share them with other organizations. Oh, hi Judith, thank you. So we have a question. Judith asks, I got touched especially on protection and safety of beneficiaries. However, it's also important to seek consent from groups, especially if you're using focus group. Oh, absolutely, yes. So you need to seek the verbal consent or the written consent, preferably written, in any environment, yes. So yeah, even in a focus group discussion, yes, you would seek consent. Catania, thank you. Yes, I believe we have to review our projects and get back to you in a PM. Yes. So you're reviewing your results framework, checking that you're happy that the results are clear, that you have indicators and data collection methods. And if you want to make any changes, you would email your portfolio manager to let them know that you want to make changes. And then we can open the system, the grants management system, so that you can enter the changes. And then for the data collection tools, you send those by email because those are typically in Word. Hopefully you all know who your portfolio manager is now, that you've been in touch with them. If not, then you can always write to me also, or Tanya. Right, well, that's quite a, we will be doing another session. What I will actually be doing is sending you a short survey. So as well as the test, I will send you the test, but I will also be asking for your opinion on what would you like to learn more about. So would you like to learn more about interview techniques, or would you like to learn more about focus groups? Or do you want to just know more about how to collect the baseline or set targets? So after this, we will be asking for your requests so that we can tailor Module 6 on monitoring to something more specific to your needs. So yes, feel free to make suggestions if you want anything in particular. Okay, I think I will close the session because there haven't been that many questions. I hope that means that that most of your questions were answered as it went along. So I'll say goodbye. Thank you everyone for joining. Thanks for your patience with a long session. Oh, no, suddenly someone's asked a question. But as I said, if anybody wants to leave, feel free. Okay. Andrew, causal attribution evaluation. If perceptions improve over time, how can we know whether it was due to the intervention? Any clues on how to create comparison dupes? That's a very good question. Yeah, you will never know exactly whether it's to do solely to your intervention, although you can ask specific questions in interviews. If the beneficiaries are familiar with your project, you can ask them a very specific question on how do you feel about this specific project. You can also sort of ask questions very specific to your project activities, and sort of probe them on, what did you get out of that capacity building, or how do you feel about your interactions with the NGO. On creating comparison groups, that's tough. So I'm sorry, Andrew, I don't know which organization you're from. It depends on the scale of your project, whether or not you have the money, because obviously that's going to cost more money. And there's also definitely ethical questions around comparison groups. So by that, if you were going to interview beneficiaries in a different community that were not receiving services from your project, there are ethical issues around that, because obviously it's a shame that they're not getting the same services. If you're able to partner with a university, that's a good way of doing it. If you're able to partner with a research institution, an independent agency, or a university who is doing research that could then lead to something useful, that is a good way to do it, because then they can take over and they can do a study both in the community you're targeting and in another community. They may even be able to partner with a different NGO, and ask similar questions in each community. But that obviously will cost more money. So there's absolutely no obligation on our end. We don't expect that at all. And we know that that the attribution can be slightly tough. But this is why we have the independent evaluation at the end. And a trained, skilled external evaluator will know how to probe and to be able to triangulate data, to be able to get information on whether or not it was your project. So they will be able to review, well, what other projects are going on in the area, and ask very specific questions during focus groups or interviews. So I hope that helps somewhat, but that's something that we could take offline and talk with your portfolio manager. And if you did have the money or the appetite to look into comparison groups, we could discuss that further. Great question. Great. Wonderful that there's so many of you still here. Okay. Well, that's it. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. And you'll have a break next week. There's no session next week. We will be reconvening on November the 5th, I believe. For the next session is on financial management. But we will return to monitoring in a few weeks. Yes, so the next session is November the 6th. There won't be one next week. November the 6th, and the next one is on financial management. Great. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Have a good week. Take care, everyone. Thank you.